The streets of the Bronx were unforgiving that night. Snowflakes fell like shards of glass, whipped by a merciless wind that cut through even the thickest coats. Charles Anderson gripped the leather steering wheel of his black Bentley, the heated interior doing little to thaw the icy feeling in his chest. He had everything: wealth, power, influence. Yet, the hollow silence of his penthouse apartment in Manhattan gnawed at him. Tonight, he had taken a detour, far from the opulence of the Upper East Side, seeking something he couldn't define. As he slowed at a red light, his gaze caught movement on the corner. A small figure, hunched and trembling, sat against the base of a graffitied wall. The child, no more than 10, wore a tattered coat far too thin for the biting cold. Her pale face was streaked with dirt, her blue eyes wide and vacant, as she clutched a frayed doll missing an arm. Beside her, a cardboard sign read in scrawled letters, "Hungry. Please help." Charles's heart twisted. Memories of his own childhood in Harlem flooded back, nights spent shivering in the dark. The ache of an empty stomach. He had clawed his way out of that life, but the scars lingered. Against his better judgment, he pulled over. "Excuse me," he called, stepping out of the car. The cold hit him instantly. But the child didn't flinch. She only tightened her grip on the doll. "Are you alone?" The girl looked up, her lips blue and trembling. "Go away," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I don't need anything." Charles knelt, his tailored coat brushing the icy pavement. "You'll freeze out here. Let me help." For a moment, she stared at him, suspicion flickering in her eyes. Then, as if her strength had given out, she slumped forward. Without hesitation, Charles scooped her up. She was as light as air, her frail body shaking violently. By the time Charles reached his penthouse, the girl was semi-conscious, her head resting against his chest. Linda Harper, his longtime assistant, was waiting in the foyer. Her eyes widened at the sight. "Mr. Anderson," she began cautiously. "Who is this?" "A child," Charles replied curtly, brushing past her. "She needs help." Linda followed him into the living room, where he laid the girl on the couch. "I don't mean to overstep, but this could be misunderstood. A man like you, bringing a child home?" Charles shot her a sharp look. "Do you think I care what people think?" Linda hesitated. "The media won't see it that way. Neither will your rivals." Charles ignored her, focusing on the girl. "Bring me some blankets, and call Dr. Patel. Tell him it's urgent." As Linda left, her doubts lingered. She admired Charles's generosity, but she also knew the world they lived in. A wealthy black man rescuing a white girl from the streets would ignite a firestorm of suspicion and scrutiny. The girl stirred as warmth seeped into her. When her eyes opened, she flinched at the unfamiliar surroundings: polished marble floors, towering glass windows overlooking the city. She tried to sit up, but Charles gently pressed her back. "You're safe," he said softly. "What's your name?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, in a voice barely audible, she whispered, "Emily, Emily." He repeated, "Do you have family? Someone I can call?" Her expression darkened, and she shook her head. "Nobody." Charles frowned. "How long have you been on the streets?" She didn't reply, but her silence spoke volumes. He decided not to press further. "You don't have to talk about it now. Just rest." Emily's eyes darted around, wary and distrustful. "Why are you helping me?" The question caught him off guard. "Because no one helped me when I was your age," he said simply. "And everyone deserves a chance." For the first time, something flickered in her eyes: hope, or perhaps disbelief. She turned away, clutching her doll tightly. The next morning, the tabloids erupted. "Mysterious rescuer. Billionaire Charles Anderson takes in homeless white girl," screamed one headline. Another speculated darkly, "What's his real motive?" Charles barely glanced at the papers. But Linda's warning proved true. At his office, board members whispered behind his back. His rival, Jonathan Marks, seized the opportunity to stir controversy, leaking rumors that Charles's actions were a publicity stunt, or worse, something sinister. That evening, Linda confronted him again. "Mr. Anderson, this situation is spiraling. Have you thought about what's next?" Charles met her gaze, his tone firm. "Yes, I'm going to help her rebuild her life. And no amount of gossip will stop me." Linda sighed. "You're putting everything on the line. I've faced worse." Over the next few days, Charles worked to earn Emily's trust. He bought her clothes, arranged for her medical care, and filled his home with warmth and safety. Yet, the girl remained guarded, speaking little and keeping her distance. One night, as Charles sat by the fire, Emily approached hesitantly. "Why do people hate you?" she asked bluntly. He looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "The news. The people on TV. They say bad things about you." Charles sighed, his voice heavy. "Sometimes, people judge others for things they don't understand. My skin color, my success, it doesn't fit what they think is normal." Emily frowned, her young mind grappling with concepts too big for her years. "That's stupid." Charles smiled. "Yes, it is." For the first time, she sat beside him. "Thank you," she murmured, clutching the doll, "for everything." In that moment, Charles felt the weight of his decision lift slightly. The bond between them, fragile but growing, gave him hope. The following weeks brought a rhythm to the once chaotic lives of Charles and Emily. In his sprawling penthouse, filled with modern art and minimalist furniture, the sounds of Emily's quiet footsteps were a reminder that Charles's world was changing. Each morning, she appeared in the kitchen, dressed in the new clothes he'd bought her but still clutching her old doll. "Good morning, Emily," Charles greeted one day, attempting a smile as he poured her a glass of orange juice. Emily glanced at him cautiously, nodding. The warmth of his home was still foreign, but she was beginning to settle in, her once constant look of suspicion giving way to small glimpses of curiosity. Charles slid a plate of pancakes toward her. "You're going to school today?" Emily froze, her fork hovering midair. "School?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "Yes, you need to learn, Emily. It's important." "I don't belong there," she muttered, her shoulders shrinking. "People will laugh at me." Charles crouched down to meet her gaze. "You belong wherever you choose to be. And if anyone tries to tell you otherwise, they'll have to answer to me." Her lips twitched, almost forming a smile. "Promise?" "Promise." Emily's first day at Willow Creek Academy, a prestigious private school, was nothing short of daunting. The sight of her tiny frame and the oversized uniform made her look even more vulnerable as she clutched her backpack. Staring at the towering gates, "Remember, hold your head high," Charles said as they stepped out of the car, his own heart tightening. He had fought for her to be admitted, facing pushback from school officials who cloaked their prejudice in bureaucratic excuses. As they walked through the entrance, whispers followed, children stared, their curious eyes darting between Emily and Charles. One parent, a sharp-dressed man in a tailored suit, leaned toward his companion and muttered, "What's a girl like that doing with someone like him?" Charles's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. Emily clung to his side, her knuckles white. "Don't worry about them," he said quietly. "Just focus on you." In the classroom, her teacher, Mrs. Lillian Brooks, welcomed her warmly. "We're so happy to have you, Emily," she said, kneeling to her level. "You're going to do great here." Emily nodded timidly, taking her seat, but as Charles left, his heart was heavy. He had given her a chance, but the battle for acceptance was only beginning. By the time Emily returned home, the initial excitement of her new surroundings had worn off. She sat at the dining table, poking at her dinner as Charles tried to draw her out. "How was school?" he asked. She shrugged. "Okay, just okay?" Emily hesitated. "Some kids asked why you're black and I'm white." Charles paused, setting down his fork. He had anticipated this but wasn't sure how to explain it to a 10-year-old. "What did you say?" "I told them you're my dad," she said softly, her gaze dropping, but they laughed. Charles felt a pang in his chest. "Emily, you don't have to explain us to anyone. Families aren't always about who looks like who. They're about love, trust, and being there for each other." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Then why don't they see it?" "Because some people don't know how to see past their own narrow world. But that's their problem, not ours." As Charles worked to integrate Emily into her new life, his own was becoming more complicated. At a high-stakes board meeting, Jonathan Marks made his latest move, proposing a merger with a rival company. "This will double our market share," Marks declared, his smile a thin veneer. "But we'll need to adjust some leadership roles." Charles, sensing the underlying threat, pushed back. "You mean you want me out?" Marks leaned back, feigning innocence. "Of course not, Charles, but with all the distractions in your personal life, perhaps you should consider stepping back." The room tensed. Charles's gaze swept across the table, noting the uncertain expressions of his colleagues. "My personal life has no bearing on my ability to lead." he said firmly, and I have no intention of stepping aside. Marx's smirk faltered, but the tension was far from over. Outside the boardroom, Marx whispered to a journalist. Anderson's judgment is slipping. That girl he picked up? Something doesn't add up. The next morning, headlines screamed. Charles Anderson, savior or scandal? The storm outside didn't reach Emily's small world in the penthouse. One evening, as Charles worked late in his study, he heard a knock at the door. Emily stood there, clutching a piece of paper. Can you help me with this? She asked hesitantly, holding up her math homework. Charles smiled, setting aside his work. Of course, come on in. As they worked through the problems, Emily began to open up, sharing little snippets of her day. There's a girl in my class, Sophie. She said she likes my doll. Did you tell her its name? Charles asked. No, Emily said, hugging the doll. It's my secret. He chuckled. Fair enough. When they finished, Emily lingered. Why are you so nice to me? The question hit him unexpectedly. Because you deserve it, he said after a pause. And because I see something special in you. Emily. For the first time, she smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up the room. Charles felt his resolve harden. No matter what the world threw at him, he would protect her. Despite their growing bond, the outside world continued to intrude. A social worker, Anita Reynolds, appeared at Charles's door one afternoon, clipboard in hand. Mr. Anderson, we've received some concerns regarding your guardianship of Emily Miller. Charles stiffened. Concerns from whom? I'm afraid I can't disclose that, Anita said, her tone professional but firm. But I'll need to conduct an evaluation. Emily appeared in the hallway, her face pale. Who's that? It's okay, Emily, Charles said, his voice steady. Just someone asking questions. As Anita conducted her interview, Emily sat nervously on the couch, clutching her doll. Do you like living here? Anita asked. Emily nodded quickly. Yes. Has Mr. Anderson ever made you feel unsafe? Her eyes widened. No, he's the nicest person I've ever met. Charles watched, his hands clenched. The session ended without incident. But Anita's parting words lingered. We'll be in touch. The unease from the social worker's visit lingered long after she left. That evening, as Emily slept in her room, Charles found himself staring out at the Manhattan skyline, his mind racing. Emily was safe now, but her silence about her past gnawed at him. Who had abandoned her? Why? And what demons might resurface to threaten the fragile life they were building? Determined to find answers, Charles made a call to Marcus Kane, a private investigator known for his tenacity and discretion. I need you to dig into a sensitive matter, Charles said, his voice low. The girl I've taken in, Emily Miller. I want to know where she came from, and why she was left on the streets. There was a pause before Marcus replied. You sure about this? Sometimes, digging up the past brings trouble. I don't care, Charles said firmly. She deserves to know the truth. A week later, Marcus returned with a file thick with photos, documents, and notes. Charles pored over it, the pieces of Emily's life slowly coming into focus. Her mother, Susan Miller, had once lived in a small rural town in Pennsylvania. Widowed young, Susan had struggled to provide for Emily after losing her husband in a workplace accident. Facing mounting debts and eviction, she had left Emily in the care of a local shelter while she sought work in the city. But something had gone horribly wrong. The shelter had closed unexpectedly, and Emily had fallen through the cracks of an overwhelmed system. By the time Susan returned, Emily was gone, and she had spent years searching fruitlessly. Charles's chest tightened as he read the final note. Susan Miller is still alive, living in a small apartment in Philadelphia. Charles debated whether to reach out. Susan's story was heartbreaking, but he couldn't ignore the possibility that she might want to take Emily back. His connection to the girl had grown stronger, and the thought of losing her left him conflicted. After days of deliberation, Charles made the drive to Philadelphia. The apartment building was run down, its faded paint peeling under years of neglect. He found Susan in a dimly lit room, sewing patches onto a tattered quilt. Her hands were calloused, her face lined with exhaustion. Mrs. Miller? He asked. Stepping inside, Susan looked up, her eyes wary. Who are you? My name is Charles Anderson, he began. I've been caring for your daughter, Emily. The color drained from her face. Emily? She's alive? She's safe, Charles assured her. She's been living with me for the past few months. Tears welled in Susan's eyes as she sank into a chair. I thought I'd lost her forever. Charles hesitated. She doesn't remember much about you. I didn't want to tell her until I was sure you were ready. Susan gripped his arm, desperation in her voice. Please, let me see her. She's my little girl. Back in New York, Charles prepared Emily for the meeting. But the girl was hesitant. What if she doesn't want me? Emily whispered, her fingers twisting the fabric of her dress. She does, Charles said gently. She's been looking for you all this time. When Susan arrived, the reunion was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. Emily stood frozen as Susan approached, her hands trembling. Emily, she said softly, tears streaming down her face. It's me, Mommy. Emily's eyes widened, and for a moment, she didn't move. Then, as if something clicked, she ran into Susan's arms, sobbing. Mommy. Charles watched from a distance, his emotions a tangle of relief and sorrow. This was what Emily deserved. But where did it leave him? The joy of the reunion was soon tempered by logistical realities. Susan wanted to bring Emily back to Philadelphia. But Charles resisted. He argued that Emily had started a new life, with access to the best education and opportunities. We both love her, Charles said during a tense conversation. But ripping her out of her new life won't help her. Susan's eyes flashed. She's my daughter. I'm her mother. And where were you when she was alone on the streets? Charles shot back, instantly regretting his words. Susan flinched as if struck. I didn't abandon her, she said, her voice shaking. I trusted a system that failed us. The argument reached a boiling point, and Susan threatened to pursue custody through the courts. News of the custody battle spread quickly, fueling a media frenzy. The headlines turned ugly, framing the situation as a racial and economic clash. Billionaire battles poor mother for custody of homeless girl was plastered across every major outlet. Charles's legal team warned him that the case could damage his reputation irreparably. The court might side with the biological mother. His lawyer, Anthony Graves, said, "Are you sure you want to fight this?" "I'm not fighting for myself," Charles replied. "I'm fighting for Emily's future." In court, the tension was palpable. Susan's attorney painted her as a loving mother who had been a victim of circumstance, while Charles's team emphasized his ability to provide stability and resources. The judge, an older woman with a stern demeanor, listened intently, her expression unreadable. The turning point came when Emily was called to testify. Her small figure seemed dwarfed by the courtroom, but her voice was steady as she spoke. "I love my mom," she said, glancing at Susan. "But Mr. Charles, he saved me. He gave me a home when I didn't have one. I don't want to lose either of them." Her words hung in the air, raw and honest. Even the judge seemed moved. After a brief recess, the court delivered its decision: shared custody. Emily would remain with Charles during the school year and spend summers with Susan. The shared custody arrangement brought a mix of relief and new challenges. For Emily, it meant splitting her life between two worlds. During the school year, she lived in Charles's sleek, modern penthouse, surrounded by books, tutors, and endless possibilities. Summers in Philadelphia were simpler, filled with the smell of sewing fabric in Susan's cramped apartment, where love compensated for the lack of material comforts. But for Charles and Susan, navigating this balance was anything but simple. "You spoil her," Susan said one afternoon as they met to exchange Emily at the halfway point between New York and Philadelphia. Charles frowned. "I give her opportunities. There's a difference." Susan folded her arms. "She doesn't need another piano teacher or trips to Europe. She needs to know what it's like to live in the real world." "She's already lived in the real world, Susan," Charles said, his voice sharp. "I'm trying to give her a better one." Their arguments grew more frequent but also more nuanced. Slowly, they began to recognize the shared purpose beneath their clashes. Both loved Emily fiercely, albeit in different ways. Meanwhile, Jonathan Marks wasn't finished with his vendetta against Charles. With his earlier attempts to sabotage Charles's reputation failing, Jonathan shifted tactics. He discovered Susan's modest sewing business and saw an opportunity to exploit her vulnerability. One afternoon, Susan found herself sitting across from Jonathan in a Philadelphia cafe. His polished demeanor and too friendly smile put her on edge. "I heard about your inspiring story," Jonathan began, "raising your daughter under such difficult circumstances. Truly remarkable." Susan narrowed her eyes. "What do you want?" Jonathan leaned forward, his voice smooth. "I'd like to invest in your business." help you expand, maybe even move to a better location. Susan hesitated. The offer was tempting, but something about Jonathan's tone felt off. Why would you do that? Let's just say I believe in helping hardworking people, he said with a smile. But what he didn't say was that he intended to use Susan's financial dependence on him to drive a wedge between her and Charles. Back in New York, Emily was beginning to come into her own. Her school had become less intimidating, and she even made a few close friends. But it was her involvement in a community volunteer program that truly brought her out of her shell. Every Saturday, Emily helped serve meals at a homeless shelter, the experience reconnecting her with the life she had left behind. These kids remind me of me, she told Charles one evening. I want to do more for them. Charles watched her with pride. You're already making a difference, Emily. And if there's anything more you want to do, just say the word. Encouraged by his support, Emily began organizing fundraisers, using her story to inspire others. Her efforts caught the attention of local news outlets, and soon she was being hailed as a symbol of resilience and hope. Jonathan's plan began to take shape when Susan received an eviction notice. Her landlord, pressured by a real estate development company connected to Jonathan, demanded she vacate the space within 30 days. Panicked, Susan called Charles. They're kicking me out. I don't have anywhere to go. Charles, suspicious of the timing, offered to cover her rent or find her a new space. But Susan bristled. I don't need your charity, she snapped. I'll handle this myself. Desperate, Susan turned to Jonathan, who offered her a lifeline, a sizable loan with favorable terms. Consider it a partnership, he said. Together, we can make your business thrive. Reluctantly, Susan agreed, unaware of the strings attached. Months passed, and Susan's business flourished under Jonathan's support. But his true intentions became clear when he demanded repayment on impossible terms, threatening to seize her shop and belongings if she failed. You can't do this, Susan cried, her voice shaking. This isn't what we agreed on. Jonathan's smile was cold. It's business, Susan. You should have read the fine print. Realizing she had been manipulated, Susan turned to Charles for help. You were right, she admitted tearfully. I shouldn't have trusted him. Charles didn't gloat. Instead, he sprang into action, mobilizing his legal team to challenge Jonathan's predatory tactics. But the fight would be long and grueling. As news of Susan's plight spread, Emily took the lead in rallying support. She organized a protest outside the developer's office, drawing crowds of local residents, small business owners, and media. This isn't just about my mom, Emily said, her voice strong as she addressed the crowd. It's about everyone who's ever been taken advantage of by people who think money means they can do whatever they want. Her words struck a chord, and the movement gained momentum. Under pressure from bad publicity and public outcry, the developer backed down, allowing Susan to keep her shop. Watching from the sidelines, Charles felt a swell of pride. Emily wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Despite the victory, tensions remained between Charles and Susan. The scars of their earlier conflicts hadn't fully healed, and the looming presence of Jonathan continued to cast a shadow. One evening, as they sat across from each other at a diner, Charles spoke candidly. We can't keep fighting like this, Susan. It's not good for Emily. Susan nodded, her expression softening. I know, I've always had to fight for everything. It's hard to let go of that. You're not alone anymore, Charles said. We're on the same side. For the first time, Susan smiled. Maybe we are. Jonathan Marks wasn't accustomed to losing. The public fallout from Emily's protest and the developer's retreat had tarnished his reputation. And his animosity toward Charles grew venomous. Determined to regain his footing, Jonathan devised a more ruthless strategy, targeting Charles's business empire directly. In a shadowy meeting with a group of discontented board members, Jonathan pitched his plan. Anderson's distracted, he said smoothly, his voice dripping with malice. His personal affairs have made him vulnerable. It's time we remind him who's really in control. The boardroom murmured in agreement, and Jonathan's lips curled into a satisfied smile. The attack began subtly. Key contracts were mysteriously delayed. Suppliers suddenly backed out, and rumors of financial instability spread through the industry. Charles initially dismissed these as minor setbacks, but as the pattern became clear, he knew Jonathan was behind it. Linda Harper, his ever-loyal assistant, burst into his office one morning, holding a folder. It's worse than we thought, she said grimly. One of the board members is leaking internal information to Marks. Charles's jaw tightened. Who? Linda hesitated. We don't know yet, but I've narrowed it down to 3 suspects. Charles leaned back, frustration etched into his features. We're bleeding. Linda, if we don't stop this now, the company won't survive. Meanwhile, Emily's world at school was undergoing a transformation. Her activism during Susan's protest had turned her into a symbol of resilience. And other students began seeking her out for advice. One day, a shy girl named Chloe approached her during lunch. I heard what you did for your mom, Chloe said, her voice barely above a whisper. My dad says we're going to lose our house. I don't know what to do. Emily felt a pang of empathy. We can figure this out together, she said, her determination shining through. Tell me everything. Emily's growing role as a leader brought her a sense of purpose. But it also caught the attention of the school's administration. During a PTA meeting, a group of parents voiced concerns about her influence. She's just a kid, one parent said dismissively. She shouldn't be leading protests. But Emily's teacher, Mrs. Brooks, stood up in her defense. She's not just a kid, she's a leader. And we should be encouraging that, not stifling it. Back at the company, Charles launched a counteroffensive. He called an emergency board meeting, determined to root out the traitor among them. The room was tense as Charles addressed the group, his voice steely. Someone in this room has been working against us, he said, and I have evidence to prove it. He handed a dossier to Linda, who distributed it to the board members. Inside were emails, financial records, and incriminating documents linking Jonathan to one of the directors, Paul Sterling. Sterling paled as the room erupted in whispers. This is ridiculous, he stammered. You can't prove anything. Oh, but I can, Charles said, his voice cold, and I'll make sure the authorities know as well. Sterling was escorted out, and Jonathan's influence over the board crumbled. The victory, though hard won, left Charles exhausted. It's not over yet, he muttered to Linda as they left the meeting. Jonathan's not going to stop. In Philadelphia, Susan faced a challenge of her own. A competitor had opened a boutique just a block from her shop, luring away customers with aggressive marketing and flashy displays. Determined not to lose her footing, Susan devised a plan to fight back. She enlisted Emily's help in designing a campaign that emphasized the personal touch and authenticity of her handmade products. Together, they created flyers, launched a social media page, and hosted a community event to showcase Susan's work. The event was a resounding success, drawing crowds from across the neighborhood. As Susan watched customers pour into her shop, she felt a surge of pride. We did it, she said, hugging Emily tightly. You did it, Mom, Emily replied with a smile. I just helped. Emily's activism continued to draw attention, and she was invited to speak at a citywide youth conference about her experiences. Nervous but determined, she stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding as she faced the crowd. 2 years ago, I was sitting on a cold street corner, thinking no one cared about me. She began, her voice trembling slightly. But then someone showed me that one act of kindness can change everything. Her speech, raw and heartfelt, earned a standing ovation. In the audience, Charles and Susan watched with tears in their eyes, their differences momentarily forgotten as they shared a profound sense of pride. With his corporate sabotage failing and his reputation in tatters, Jonathan grew desperate. He orchestrated a smear campaign against Charles, spreading false allegations through tabloid media. The headlines were brutal. Anderson's dark secrets exposed. Although the accusations were baseless, the damage to Charles's public image was significant. This is war, Linda said as they strategized their next move. We need to hit back hard. Charles nodded. Then let's give the media the real story about Jonathan. With the help of his legal team, Charles unearthed evidence of Jonathan's corrupt dealings, including fraudulent contracts and embezzlement. The revelations not only cleared Charles's name but also led to Jonathan's arrest. The downfall of Jonathan Marks marked a turning point. With the threat neutralized, Charles's company rebounded, stronger than ever. Susan's business also flourished, cementing her place in the community. For Emily, the experience brought clarity. We're not just a family, she said during a quiet evening with Charles and Susan. We're a team, and together, we can do anything. Charles and Susan exchanged a look, their past conflicts fading in the face of their shared love for Emily. She's right, Susan said with a smile. We make a good team. Although Jonathan Marks had been arrested, the fallout from his schemes left lingering effects. For Charles, rebuilding his company's reputation was an uphill battle. Media attention still clung to the scandal, and competitors circled like vultures, waiting for a misstep. Meanwhile, Susan's shop thrived, but her trust in others had been deeply shaken by Jonathan's betrayal. She threw herself into her work, often staying late into the night, driven by a fear that her success could vanish at any moment. Emily sensed the tension in both her guardians. "You don't have to do it all alone," she told Susan one evening, watching her mother hem a dress. "That's what family's for." Susan smiled but said nothing. She didn't want to burden her daughter with her fears. Just as the dust seemed to settle, an unexpected lawsuit hit Charles's desk. The document accused him of breaching contracts tied to one of Jonathan's failed deals. At first glance, it seemed like a desperate attempt to drag Charles back into controversy. But his lawyer, Anthony Graves, wasn't so sure. "This isn't just a frivolous lawsuit," Anthony warned during a tense meeting. "The plaintiff's lawyers are well funded. Someone's bankrolling this." Charles leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "Jonathan's behind bars. Who else would want to come after me?" "We'll dig into it," Anthony assured him, "but this case could get messy." The looming legal battle placed additional strain on Charles, who was already juggling his responsibilities at work and at home. He didn't want Emily or Susan to worry, so he kept the lawsuit to himself, for now. While Charles prepared for his legal fight, Susan achieved a personal milestone. She was invited to showcase her designs at a local fashion event. The invitation marked a turning point for her business, signaling recognition beyond the community. Emily beamed with pride as she helped her mother prepare. "You're going to be amazing," she said, holding up one of Susan's intricately embroidered dresses. "Everyone will see how talented you are." On the night of the event, Susan's collection was met with enthusiastic applause. Several boutique owners approached her with offers to collaborate, solidifying her place in the industry. As she stood on the small stage, accepting a certificate of recognition, Susan's eyes searched the crowd for Charles and Emily. When she found them, clapping loudly from the front row, her heart swelled with gratitude. Back at school, Emily faced a challenge of her own. A group of students had been bullying a new girl, Mia, who was shy and wore second-hand clothes. The situation reminded Emily of her own struggles, and she refused to stand by. One day, as the bullies cornered Mia in the hallway, Emily stepped in. "Leave her alone," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. One of the bullies sneered. "Why do you care? She's not your problem." "She's not your problem either," Emily shot back. "But treating people like garbage? That's everyone's problem." Her courage caught the attention of a teacher, who intervened and disciplined the bullies. Word of Emily's actions spread, earning her admiration from both students and staff. When Emily told Charles and Susan about the incident that evening, Charles smiled. "You've got more courage than most adults I know," he said. "Never lose that." The day of Charles's court hearing arrived, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The plaintiff's lawyers, aggressive and well-prepared, presented a case built on manipulated documents and testimonies from former employees Jonathan had bribed. Charles's legal team fought back, systematically dismantling the false claims. But the turning point came when Linda uncovered an email chain proving the plaintiff's connection to Jonathan's network. The revelation cast doubt on the entire case, turning the tide in Charles's favor. As the judge prepared to deliver her ruling, Charles took a moment to reflect on how far he had come. Win or lose, he knew he had fought with integrity. When the verdict was announced in his favor, relief washed over him. He had not only protected his company but also proven that he wouldn't be defeated by underhanded tactics. The victory in court was followed by an unexpected surprise. A philanthropist who had attended Susan's fashion event reached out to Charles with an offer to support Emily's growing volunteer initiatives. "We've been inspired by your family's story," the philanthropist said. "We'd like to help fund a project that could make a lasting impact." Emily, thrilled by the opportunity, proposed creating a community center that would provide resources for struggling families. "It could be a place where kids like me, kids who felt invisible, can get help," she explained. The idea resonated deeply with Charles and Susan, who threw their full support behind it. Together, they began working to turn Emily's vision into reality. Construction on the community center, named Hope Haven, began within months. Emily took an active role in its design, insisting on spaces that felt welcoming and inclusive. She also organized a series of fundraisers, drawing on her growing network of supporters. The project brought the family closer than ever. Charles handled the logistics, Susan contributed her creative touch, and Emily became the face of the campaign, speaking passionately about the center's mission. During the grand opening ceremony, Emily stood on stage with Charles and Susan by her side. "This center isn't just a building," she told the crowd. "It's a promise that no one has to face life's challenges alone." The applause that followed was thunderous. And for a moment, all the struggles they had endured seemed worth it. With Hope Haven thriving in their individual battles behind them, Charles, Susan, and Emily finally found a sense of peace. Their unconventional family, forged through adversity, had become a beacon of hope for others. One evening, as they gathered for dinner, Emily looked around the table and smiled. "You know," she said, "we might not be a normal family, but I think we're perfect." Charles chuckled. "Perfect might be a stretch, but I'll take it." Susan laughed, raising her glass. "To us, and to the journey that brought us here." As they clinked glasses, the city lights glittered in the background, a reminder of the challenges they had faced and the brighter future they had built together. Hope Haven became more than a community center. It was a symbol of resilience and compassion. Families from all walks of life visited its warm, inviting space, finding not only resources but also a sense of belonging. Emily, now a recognized figure in the city, spent her weekends organizing activities for children and mentoring those who reminded her of her younger self. One day, as she walked through the center's brightly painted hallways, she spotted Mia, the shy girl she had stood up for at school, leading a group of younger children in a drawing class. "You're a natural," Emily said with a smile. Mia beamed. "I learned from you." Emily's heart swelled with pride. Hope Haven wasn't just changing lives, it was creating leaders. As life settled into a steady rhythm, Charles received an unexpected visit. Anthony Graves, his lawyer, informed him that Jonathan Marks had requested to see him. "Why would I do that?" Charles asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Anthony shrugged. "Maybe he has something to say. Maybe he's looking for redemption." Against his better judgment, Charles agreed to meet Jonathan in prison. The encounter was tense, with Jonathan visibly aged and humbled by his circumstances. "I made a lot of mistakes," Jonathan admitted, his voice hollow, "but there's something I can do to make amends. I have information about people in the industry who've been exploiting others like I did." Charles leaned forward. "Why tell me? Because I know you'll actually do something about it," Jonathan said. "You've always been better than me." Though Charles remained wary, he couldn't ignore the potential to expose systemic corruption. He agreed to look into Jonathan's claims, seeing an opportunity to create lasting change. Inspired by the success of Hope Haven, Susan began dreaming bigger for her business. With Emily's encouragement, she applied for a grant to open a second shop in New York. The grant committee invited her to present her vision at a competitive pitch event. "I can't do this," Susan said nervously, pacing the room the night before the event. "What if they think I'm not good enough?" Charles placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've already proven you're good enough. Just show them the passion that built your first shop." The next day, Susan's pitch was a triumph. She spoke with conviction about her journey, her commitment to empowering women through her work, and her vision for the future. She not only secured the grant but also earned the admiration of industry leaders. "Looks like we're all growing," Emily said later, hugging her mother tightly. True to his word, Charles began investigating the information Jonathan had provided. What he uncovered was a web of exploitation and greed that extended far beyond Jonathan's schemes. With Linda's help, he compiled evidence and partnered with a team of investigative journalists to bring the story to light. The exposé sent shockwaves through the industry. CEOs were ousted, unethical practices were dismantled, and new regulations were proposed to protect vulnerable communities. For Charles, it was a victory not just for his business but for the values he had always fought to uphold. As Emily approached her 12th birthday, Charles and Susan decided to throw her a celebration unlike any other. The event was held at Hope Haven, with dozens of families from the community in attendance. Children played games, music filled the air, and Emily was surrounded by the people who had become her extended family. During the festivities, Charles and Susan presented Emily with a scrapbook filled with photos and mementos from their journey together. "This is to remind you of how far you've come," Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. "And how much farther you'll go." Emily hugged them both tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I wouldn't be here without you." Despite the triumphs, a new challenge emerged when a city council member tried to shut down Hope Haven. Citing zoning violations, it was clear the move was politically motivated, driven by individuals who resented the center's influence. Emily, now more confident than ever, stepped up to defend the center. She organized a rally, gathering support from families, activists, and local leaders. Her speech at the rally was passionate and unyielding. "Hope Haven isn't just a building," she declared to the crowd. "It's a lifeline for people who've been ignored for too long. And we won't let anyone take that away." The overwhelming public support forced the council member to back down, securing Hope Haven's future. With the challenges behind them, Charles, Susan, and Emily reflected on how far they had come. The trials they faced had forged an unbreakable bond, turning them into a family in every sense of the word. Emily, now a young teenager, had blossomed into a confident and compassionate leader. Susan's business continued to grow, and Charles's company had not only recovered but also become a model for ethical practices. As they sat together one evening, enjoying a rare moment of quiet, Emily spoke up. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't met that day?" Charles smiled. "I don't think about that. I think about how lucky I am that we did." Susan nodded. "Me too." They clinked their glasses in a silent toast, the room filled with warmth and gratitude. Years later, Hope Haven had expanded to multiple locations, helping thousands of families across the country. Emily, now a young adult, had taken over its leadership, carrying forward the legacy her family had built. Standing on the stage at a gala event celebrating Hope Haven's achievements, Emily looked out at the audience, which included Charles and Susan sitting proudly in the front row. "This isn't just my story," Emily said. "It's the story of everyone who's ever felt unseen, unheard, or unloved. It's proof that with kindness, determination, and hope, we can overcome anything." As the crowd erupted into applause, Charles and Susan exchanged a proud glance. Their unconventional family, born from adversity, had become a beacon of hope for countless others.